She only wanted to buy Kumara for dinner when she collapsed at the market, in front of merciless cameras and stares that mistake vulnerability for guilt. Within seconds, the cry of a boy who can't bear loud noises pierced through the crowd's improvised loudspeakers whilst a stranger knelt to help them, a man so humble that no one would suspect the tempest of gold and shadows hidden in the worn pockets of his jacket. Days later, a red balloon rose slowly into the lilac sky, leaving behind a silence that chilled the spine of the entire town. When the balloon burst, only a pair of children's headphones remained on the ground, and a note that would forever change your understanding of love, wealth, and sacrifice. But what Aroha never imagined is that the gentle man who saved her autistic son was hiding a billion-dollar secret, and that this very secret would make her a widow for the second time. Subscribe to discover what happens next and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching this video from? The sun was still fighting to pierce through the thick mist that blanketed Claudeland's farmer's market when Aroha Kerao felt the world darken around her. The morning had started like any other Saturday. Nikora carefully arranging his sensory toys in precise rows on his bedroom floor, while she counted the meager coins in her purse, calculating whether she had enough for Kumara, and perhaps a small piece of hokey-pokey for her son. The ritual of Saturday morning shopping had become their sanctuary, a predictable routine that helped keep Nikora's anxiety at bay in a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too overwhelming for his sensitive mind. But nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Her legs gave way like dry branches snapping under weight, and she collapsed in front of the Kumara stall, the bright orange sweet potatoes scattering across the dew-moistened concrete like fallen stars. The elderly Maori vendor, Mrs. Parada, cried out in alarm, her weathered hands reaching instinctively to help. But the damage was already done. The sound of impact echoed between the weathered wooden stalls, reverberating off the corrugated iron roofs like a gunshot, and was instantly amplified by the sharp, desperate scream that tore through the morning air. Nikora, her 8-year-old son, began slapping his small hands against his ears with such violent force that his fingers turned bright red, then purple. The boy rocked back and forth with increasing intensity, his green eyes, so like his father's, wide with the kind of terror that reached into the depths of his soul. The sound of the crowd's voices grew around him like a storm gathering strength, each voice adding another layer to the cacophony that threatened to tear his carefully constructed world apart. The petrol blue hoodie he wore, with a kippa shell symbol that his grandmother had embroidered on the chest before she passed, was now soaked with cold sweat that made the fabric cling to his thin frame. The noise-dampening headphones that always hung around his neck, a second-hand pair Aroha had saved for months to buy, had fallen during his frantic rush to help his mum, leaving him completely vulnerable to the sensory assault. "Look at that same old scene," muttered a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, adjusting her expensive leather handbag on her shoulder whilst raising her latest iPhone with practiced precision. That Aroha always finding some way to draw attention to herself. You'd think after all these years she'd learn to manage better. The words came loaded with a contempt that had been brewing in the small Hamilton community for years, ever since Aroha had become a widow and struggled to raise an autistic child on her own. Each syllable cut through the air like a sharpened blade, and Aroha, even in the fog of slowly returning consciousness, felt each word like a physical blow to her already fragile sense of dignity. The woman's companion, a man in an expensive barber jacket that marked him as one of the wealthy farmers from the outskirts of town, nodded in agreement. "Should have put that boy in a proper facility years ago. Not fair on the rest of us, having to deal with these scenes every week." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never known real hardship, who saw Aroha's struggles as a personal inconvenience rather than a mother's desperate attempt to give her son a normal life. Around her, mobiles rose like spears on a battlefield, screens capturing every second of her humiliation for social media posts that would undoubtedly be shared with cruel commentary. Camera flashes began flickering, creating a strobe light effect that only worsened Nikora's condition. The boy began babbling words in Te Reo Maori, phrases his great-grandmother had taught him as comfort words, but no one in the predominantly Pakeha crowd understood their meaning. His hands trembled as he tried to find something familiar to hold on to, his fingers grasping at air while his world spun out of control. "Kaore Hiraru, Kaore Hiraru," Nikora repeated over and over, the Maori words for no trouble, becoming a desperate mantra that his young mind clung to like a life raft in a storm. But his voice was lost in the chaos of camera clicks, judgmental whispers, and the growing crowd that pressed closer with each passing second, drawn by the irresistible urge to witness someone else's misfortune. It was then that Aroha saw something that made her blood run cold and sent ice racing through her veins. Between the hurried legs of people crowding to watch the spectacle, two men wearing thick wool coats stood motionless, still as rocks in a rushing river. They were completely out of place in the casual weekend atmosphere of the market. Their clothes too formal, their posture too rigid, their attention too focused. They carried no shopping bags, displayed none of the typical rush of those who came to the Saturday morning market for fresh produce and friendly gossip. They just watched with an intensity that made Aroha's skin crawl with an inexplicable fear that reached deep into her primitive survival instincts. The taller of the two, his face partially hidden by the shadow of a black baseball cap that seemed deliberately positioned to obscure his features, pulled a phone from his coat pocket and typed something with quick, efficient movements. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone accustomed to sending coded messages, and Aroha noticed that he glanced up at her and Nikora with each word he typed, as if he were providing a real-time report of their condition and location. Nikora, even in his state of sensory overload, seemed to possess that uncanny ability that many autistic children have to sense danger that neurotypical people miss. He turned his eyes in their direction and babbled something that sounded unmistakably like a warning, his voice rising above his usual whispered tones with an urgency that made Aroha's heart race. But his words were lost in the chaos of voices and camera clicks, dismissed by the crowd as just another symptom of his condition, rather than the genuine alarm call it actually was. The tension in the air became almost tangible, like the electric charge that builds before a lightning strike. It was as if a glass bridge was about to shatter beneath everyone's feet, and only Aroha and Nikora could sense the hairline cracks spreading through their foundation. She tried to get up, her hands seeking purchase on the rough concrete floor that was still slick with morning dew and scattered kumara. But her muscles felt like jelly, unresponsive to her desperate commands. The world spun around her in a nauseating kaleidoscope of colors and sounds, faces and voices blending together until she couldn't distinguish friend from stranger, help from harm. It was at that moment that a figure emerged from the crowd like a lighthouse beacon cutting through fog, a man of medium height, with sparse reddish-brown facial hair that caught the filtered sunlight, and a brown wool jacket so weathered by time and honest work that it seemed to tell stories of seasons spent outdoors. Tom Hatherwick moved through the people with quiet determination, his presence somehow commanding respect without demanding attention. He said not a word as he knelt beside Aroha, his blue eyes the color of Lake Taupo on a clear winter morning, reflecting genuine concern that contrasted sharply with the morbid curiosity of the onlookers. "You're all right," murmured Tom, his voice carrying that distinctive Kiwi accent but with undertones that suggested education and refinement beneath the farmer's exterior. The words were low and reassuring as he offered a stainless steel water bottle that he'd pulled from a small canvas backpack, the kind of bottle that cost more than Aroha spent on groceries in a week, though she was too distressed to notice such details at the time. "Just breathe slowly, love. You've had a bit of a turn, but you're safe now." His hands, calloused from what appeared to be years of working the land, helped Aroha sit up with a gentleness that she hadn't expected from a stranger. There was something in his touch that spoke of experience with vulnerable creatures, the way a farmer might handle a newborn lamb or comfort a frightened horse. His movements were confident but never forceful, protective but not possessive, creating a bubble of calm in the midst of chaos. But what Tom did next truly surprised everyone watching. He turned to Nikora, who was still lost in his panic, rocking back and forth with increasing violence as the sensory overload threatened to overwhelm his young nervous system. Without hesitation, Tom calmly reached into an inner pocket of his weathered jacket and pulled out a pair of professional-grade noise-dampening headphones. Not the cheap plastic kind sold in electronics stores, but the type used by sound engineers and musicians, worth several $100s and impossible to find in rural New Zealand without special ordering. "Here, mate," he said softly, his voice carrying the easy familiarity that Kiwis used with each other, but with an underlying gentleness that suggested real understanding of Nikora's condition. "This'll help with the noise. I know it's too much right now, but these will make it better." The headphones were black and silver, sleek and obviously expensive, with padding that looked impossibly soft, and adjustment mechanisms that spoke of precision engineering. As Tom placed them carefully over Nikora's ears, adjusting the fit with the practiced ease of someone who understood both the equipment and the need. Something almost magical happened. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Within seconds, Nicora's shoulders relaxed as if invisible weights had been lifted from them. His breathing, which had been coming in short, panicked gasps, became deeper and more regular. The violent rocking that had threatened to injure him slowed, then stopped completely, replaced by the gentle swaying that was his natural, self-soothing rhythm. He looked up at Tom with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and wonder, as if he were seeing an angel who had descended specifically to rescue him from his personal hell. For the first time in what felt like hours but had probably been only minutes, Nicora smiled. A genuine, peaceful expression that transformed his face from that of a terrified child to simply a boy who had found unexpected kindness in a cruel world. He reached out with one small hand and touched Tom's weathered jacket, his fingers tracing the fabric with the sort of tactile exploration that brought him comfort. Meanwhile, an ambulance had materialized at the edge of the market. Though no one could say exactly who had called it or when it had been summoned, the emergency services in Hamilton were efficient, but this seemed almost too prompt, as if someone had anticipated the need before the crisis had even fully developed. 2 paramedics descended quickly, carrying equipment and asking the rapid-fire questions that medical professionals use to assess emergencies. A young Maori man with traditional tomoko covering his forearm, and a middle-aged Pakeha woman with the efficient movements of someone who had seen everything in her 20-year career. Tom remained beside them throughout the assessment, providing information about what he'd witnessed with the sort of detailed observations that suggested either medical training or extensive experience with emergency situations. His presence was strangely comforting amid the chaos, like an anchor point that kept everything from spinning completely out of control. She collapsed suddenly, Tom explained to the male paramedic, his voice calm and clear despite the surrounding commotion. No obvious precipitating factors. She was just selecting vegetables when her legs gave way. The son has autism spectrum disorder and became severely distressed by the crowd noise and commotion. He's much better now with proper hearing protection. The terminology he used, precipitating factors, autism spectrum disorder, wasn't the language of a simple farmer. It was clinical, precise, the vocabulary of someone with medical knowledge or extensive experience with developmental conditions. But Tom delivered it so naturally that only someone paying very close attention would notice the discrepancy between his appearance and his expertise. Aroha, still dizzy but managing to process what was happening around her, looked at Tom with eyes that were beginning to fill with tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion and embarrassment. "I don't know how to thank you. Those headphones, the way you helped Nicora. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Tom's response was a smile that seemed to light up his entire face, modest and warm, but tinged with something that might have been sadness. It was the sort of smile that belonged to someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to wish desperately that you could save everyone, but had learned that sometimes you could only save one person at a time. "No need to thank me, love. We all need help sometimes. That's what being human is about, looking after each other when the world gets too hard to handle alone." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, Aroha noticed something that didn't quite fit with the image of a simple farmer that Tom presented. The headphones he'd given Nicora were clearly expensive, far beyond what someone of modest means would carry casually in their jacket pocket. His vocabulary, his calm competence in a medical emergency, the way he'd appeared exactly when needed most, it all suggested depths that his weathered clothes and calloused hands didn't fully explain. As the paramedics prepared Aroha for transport to Waikato Hospital, she noticed something in the reflection of the ambulance's rear window that made her stomach clench with renewed fear. The 2 men in wool coats were still there, still watching, and the taller one was still holding his phone. Though she couldn't hear his words clearly over the noise of the medical equipment and the dispersing crowd, she could see his lips moving rapidly, as if he were providing a detailed report to someone on the other end of the line. Then, just as the ambulance doors were being closed and the last of the crowd was beginning to disperse, a sound reached her ears that made her blood freeze in her veins. A voice, hoarse and authoritative, escaped from the phone of the man in the black cap at just the right volume and pitch to carry over the ambient noise. "It's her. Target confirmed. Prepare for phase 2. The words were followed by something even more chilling. The voice mentioned Nicora's name, Not just once, but twice, discussing him with the sort of familiarity that suggested extensive surveillance and planning. They knew her son's name, his condition, probably his routines and vulnerabilities. This wasn't a chance encounter or a random act of violence. This was something that had been planned, prepared for, and now set into motion. Aroha tried to sit up, tried to alert the paramedics to the danger she'd overheard, but the ambulance engine had already roared to life and they were pulling away from the market. Through the small rear window, she watched Tom wave goodbye, his figure growing smaller with distance, but her eyes were fixed on the two men who were now walking with purposeful strides towards a white van parked strategically at the far end of the market area. Nikora, still wearing Tom's expensive headphones and finally calm enough to process his surroundings clearly, tugged at his mother's sleeve with unusual urgency. When she looked down at him, she saw that his green eyes were wide with the sort of fear that went beyond his usual anxiety about loud noises and crowds. "Mum," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the relative quiet of the ambulance. "Those men, they had pictures of our house, and they knew my name." The simple statement hit Aroha like a physical blow. Her 8-year-old son, with his heightened awareness and attention to details that others missed, had observed something that confirmed her worst fears. They were being watched, studied, targeted for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. And somehow, impossibly, their salvation had come in the form of a mysterious stranger, whose kindness might have been the only thing standing between them and whatever those men had planned. As the ambulance carried them towards the hospital and an uncertain future, Aroha held Nikora close and wondered what they had stumbled into, and whether the guardian angel who had rescued them at the market would be enough to protect them from whatever was coming next. The sterile scent of disinfectant and floor polish filled Aroha's nostrils as consciousness slowly returned to her in the emergency ward of Waikato Hospital. The afternoon light filtering through the small reinforced window cast pale, institutional shadows across the polished linoleum floor, creating geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance as her eyes struggled to focus. Her head felt heavy, stuffed with cotton wool and confusion, whilst the events at Claudelin's market seemed like fragments of some disturbing dream that her mind was reluctant to piece together completely. But the sight of Nikora sitting quietly in the corner chair, still wearing those impossibly expensive headphones, and methodically sorting colored pencils by shade, a self-soothing behavior that emerged whenever he felt overwhelmed, brought everything flooding back with crystal clarity that made her stomach lurch. The collapse, the crowd, the cameras, those two men in wool coats who had watched them with such calculating intensity, and Tom, mysterious kind Tom who had appeared like a guardian angel carrying equipment worth more than she earned in 3 months. The hospital room was small and cramped, designed for efficiency rather than comfort, with walls painted that particular shade of institutional green that was supposed to be calming, but instead reminded everyone of illness and vulnerability. Medical equipment hummed quietly in the corner, and somewhere down the corridor she could hear the familiar sounds of a busy hospital, trolleys rolling, intercoms crackling, the soft conversations of staff going about their essential work. Through the narrow window, Aroha could see Tom at the reception desk in the main corridor, engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly animated discussion with the billing clerk. Even from this distance, she could observe the stress lines etched deep into his weathered face as he gestured towards a wallet that looked far too slim and worn for a man who casually carried professional-grade sensory equipment. His brown wool jacket hung loose on his frame, and his boots showed the kind of honest wear that came from years of outdoor work. Yet something about the entire picture felt subtly wrong, like a painting where the artist had gotten most of the details right but missed some crucial element that would make it believable. The billing clerk, a young man with the perpetually harried expression of someone dealing with New Zealand's complex public health system, was clearly explaining the costs associated with emergency treatment, ambulance transport, and the various medical assessments that Aroha had undergone. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the stress in both men's body language, the way they leaned towards each other across the counter, whilst keeping their voices deliberately low. Then something happened that made Aroha's stomach clench with a mixture of gratitude and profound unease. Tom withdrew a card from his wallet, not the typical plastic debit or credit card that most people carried, but something that gleamed with an almost metallic sheen under the fluorescent hospital lighting. The card was black, clearly premium, with what appeared to be platinum or silver accents that caught the light as he handed it to the increasingly surprised clerk. The surname embossed on the card caught the light for just a moment, and though Aroha couldn't make out all the letters clearly through the window and at this distance, She could see that it was significantly longer than the simple Hatherwick he'd introduced himself with at the market. More disturbing still, the card's obvious quality and exclusivity didn't match any part of the image Tom projected. Not the worn fabric of his brown wool jacket, not the mud-stained work boots that spoke of honest farm labor, not the calloused hands or the modest demeanor that had made her trust him instantly. The billing clerk's fingers flew across his keyboard with increasing speed, and within what seemed like mere seconds, Aroha watched in complete amazement as the monitor displaying her emergency treatment costs that would have taken her months of careful budgeting and sacrifice to pay off, simply vanished. The debt disappeared as if it had never existed, leaving no trace in the hospital's computer system. The clerk stared at his screen with his mouth literally agape, clearly as shocked as Aroha by the ease with which such a substantial amount had been settled. But the young man said nothing about the unusual transaction, just handed Tom a receipt with hands that trembled slightly. His expression suggested that he'd encountered something far outside his normal experience, something that made him understand he was dealing with forces beyond his comprehension or pay grade. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 minutes, but it left Aroha with questions that multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. In the corridor outside Aroha's room, head nurse Lyrica Rangjitoya paused in her afternoon rounds, her dark eyes narrowing as she observed the unusual transaction through the glass partition that separated the ward from the main reception area. Lyrica was a woman of 53 who had spent 30 years working in New Zealand hospitals, from small rural facilities to major urban medical centers, and her experience had taught her to recognize the signs of unusual financial activity that might indicate something wasn't quite right. The logo on that black card, glimpsed only briefly but burned into her memory with the precision that came from decades of professional observation, belonged to a private banking institution she'd only heard whispered about in connection with the country's wealthiest families. Not the merely comfortable middle-class wealth of successful farmers or business owners, but the kind of generational wealth that shaped government policy and built hospital wings, the kind of wealth that could make problems disappear with a single phone call, and had the power to ensure that certain questions were never asked. Lyrica made a mental note of every detail she could observe, her nursing training having developed her ability to catalog information that others might miss or dismiss as unimportant. The exact time of the transaction, the physical description of both men involved, the way Tom's posture suggested both authority and anxiety. All of it went into the mental file she was building because something about this entire situation felt fundamentally wrong. It was like listening to a familiar song played in the wrong key, where all the notes were technically correct, but the harmony was subtly, disturbingly off. She'd seen too many cases over the years where vulnerable families, especially single mothers struggling with disabled children, became entangled with people who had hidden agendas and ulterior motives. The expensive headphones now protecting young Nikora's sensitive hearing, the mysterious credit card that could eliminate medical debt without question, the appearance of this helpful stranger at exactly the right moment. Individually, these might be explained as fortunate coincidences, but together they formed a pattern that set off every professional alarm bell she possessed. As she continued down the corridor towards the medication room, Lyrica noticed something else that increased her growing suspicion and concern. The same 2 men from the market, the ones in thick wool coats who had watched Aroha's collapse with such unsettling intensity, were seated in the family waiting area near the main entrance. They had positioned themselves strategically where they could observe everyone coming and going, and they were casually leafing through brochures for charitable organizations that provided assistance to struggling families. But their eyes weren't actually focused on the pamphlets they held. Instead, they were systematically scanning each face that passed, studying every person who entered or left the hospital, with the sort of professional attention that suggested surveillance training. One of them had a manila folder balanced on his lap, partially open to reveal what appeared to be surveillance photographs, black and white images that looked like they'd been taken with telephoto lenses from considerable distances. Lyrica slowed her pace, using her position as a hospital staff member to observe them more closely without arousing suspicion. The photographs visible in the folder showed what appeared to be a small weatherboard house with a distinctive red roof and a vegetable garden in the front yard. Even upside down and at an angle, she recognized the property. It was Aroha Kairau's house on the outskirts of Teawamutu, where she lived with Nikora in the modest home her late husband had left her. The afternoon air outside had grown heavy with the promise of rain that often came to the Waikato region in late autumn. and the sky had taken on that particular gray-green color that spoke of weather systems moving in from the Tasman Sea. When Tom finally returned to Aroha's room, his blue eyes held a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked disturbingly like fear that had been carefully controlled, but not entirely eliminated. He pulled a plastic visitor's chair close to her hospital bed, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that made Nikora wince slightly despite his protective headphones. Tom's hands, she noticed now with greater attention to detail, displayed an interesting contradiction. The calluses and weathering spoke of genuine outdoor work, but his fingernails were cleaner and better maintained than they should be for someone who truly worked the land on a daily basis. His posture, too, carried an authority that seemed at odds with the humble farmer image he projected. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice carrying that distinctive Kiwi accent, but with undertones that suggested education and social refinement that didn't quite match his appearance. There was an urgency beneath his words that made Aroha's pulse quicken, a barely controlled tension that suggested whatever had brought him to the market this morning was far from resolved. "Better, thanks to you," she replied, gesturing towards Nikora, who had managed to fall asleep in the uncomfortable chair despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the stress of the morning's events. Her son's face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger than his 8 years, and she felt the familiar fierce protectiveness that had sustained her through the darkest moments since her husband's death. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for those headphones, or for paying the medical bills. You didn't have to do that, and I can't imagine why a stranger would." "Yes, I did have to," Tom interrupted, his tone so firm and decisive that it startled her into silence. "Sometimes we meet people, and we just know that helping them is the right thing to do, regardless of the cost or the consequences." There was something in the way he emphasized the word consequences that made Aroha study his face more carefully, searching for clues about what he wasn't telling her. The laugh lines around his eyes spoke of a man who had known genuine joy and contentment, but there was a shadow there too, something deeper and more complex that suggested he understood loss and sacrifice in ways that went far beyond mere hardship or financial struggle. "Tom," she began hesitantly, choosing her words carefully because she sensed she was approaching dangerous ground. "Those headphones you gave Nikora, that card you used to pay the hospital bills, they're not exactly what you'd expect from someone who, from a simple farm worker?" Tom's smile was sad but knowing, tinged with the sort of resignation that comes from carrying secrets that can't be shared. "Aroha, there are things about my life that are complicated, things I haven't told anyone in this town because sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the most elaborate lies." Before she could formulate a response to this cryptic statement, Tom stood up abruptly and walked to the small window that looked out over the hospital car park. His reflection in the glass looked haunted, like a man being pursued by ghosts that only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, forcing Aroha to strain to hear him over the ambient noise of the hospital. "I need to ask you something," he said without turning around, "and I need you to trust me even though you have every reason in the world not to, even though everything about this situation should be setting off alarm bells in your head." The intensity in his voice, the barely controlled desperation beneath his carefully maintained composure, made Aroha sit up straighter in the hospital bed. Her heart began beating faster, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had become her constant companion since her husband's death. The feeling of standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step could either save her or destroy everything she held dear. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already suspected that whatever he was about to ask would change her life irrevocably. Tom turned from the window with movements that seemed to require enormous effort, as if he were fighting against every instinct that told him to run, to disappear, to protect her by removing himself from her life before he could drag her deeper into whatever dangerous world he inhabited. "Marry me," he said, the words falling into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would extend far beyond what either of them could imagine. "Today, right here, before we leave this hospital." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to every rational thought Aroha had ever possessed, every lesson her mother had taught her about being careful, about protecting herself and Nikora from a world that had already taken so much from them. "Tom, we barely know each other," she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. "This morning was the first time we'd ever met. You can't possibly be serious about—" "I know it sounds completely mad," Tom said, crossing back to her bedside with quick, urgent strides that spoke of barely controlled panic. I know every rational part of your mind is screaming at you to say no, to have me escorted from the building by security. But those men at the market, the ones who were watching you and Nikora with such interest, they're not random bystanders or curious neighbors. He paused, running his hands through his reddish-brown hair in a gesture that spoke of profound stress and exhaustion. I recognize them, Aroha. I know who they work for and why they're here. And if they're targeting you, it means someone has discovered the connection between us. Connection? What connection? I'd never seen you before today. Tom's phone buzzed against his hip with the insistent vibration of an urgent message, and he glanced at the screen with an expression that confirmed every fear that had been building in Aroha's mind since the moment she'd seen those men at the market. The text message was short, just a few lines, but she could see his face pale as he read it, could watch the color drain from his skin as if he'd received news of a death. "The civil registrar is in the building," he said quietly, his fingers already moving across the phone's keyboard with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making rapid, high-stakes decisions. "David Thornfield. He owes me a significant favor from years ago, and he can perform a legally binding ceremony right here in this room. It would be completely legitimate under New Zealand law, and it would give you certain protections that you don't currently have." "Protections from what?" "Tom, you're scaring me. What aren't you telling me?" But before Tom could answer her desperate questions, there was a soft knock on the door that made both of them freeze. A middle-aged man in a rumpled brown suit entered without waiting for permission, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the tired expression of someone who had been summoned from his weekend rest, for reasons he didn't fully understand but knew he couldn't refuse. Behind him, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment with the precision of a choreographed performance, came the two men in wool coats. They filled the small room with their presence, bringing an almost electric tension that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. "Mrs. Carrow," the registrar said, setting his briefcase on the small table beside her bed with movements that seemed deliberately formal. "I understand you're interested in a marriage ceremony this afternoon." Aroha looked from the registrar to Tom to the two men who now stood just inside the doorway, their presence transforming the small hospital room into something that felt more like a courtroom or interrogation chamber. Nikora stirred in his chair, his green eyes opening to focus on the strangers with an intensity that seemed far beyond his 8 years, his autism giving him an almost preternatural ability to sense danger and deception. "Mum," Nikora said in a voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the hum of the hospital's air conditioning system, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "The man with the folder has pictures of our house, and our car, and the playground where I like to swing." Every eye in the room turned to the boy, whose condition often made him notice details that neurotypical people missed or dismissed as unimportant. The taller of the two men shifted uncomfortably, unconsciously pulling the manila folder closer to his chest in a defensive gesture, but not before Aroha caught a much clearer glimpse of what it contained. The surveillance photographs were extensive and detailed, taken with professional equipment over what appeared to be weeks or months. Images of her hanging laundry in the backyard, of Nikora playing in their small front garden, of her car parked at various locations around Te Awamutu. Someone had been watching them, studying their routines, documenting their movements with the sort of systematic thoroughness that spoke of serious planning for something significant. Tom's hand found hers across the hospital bed, and she could feel the tremor running through his fingers, the barely controlled fear that he was working so hard to hide from everyone in the room. "Aroha," he said urgently, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "I need you to say yes. I need you to trust me. Just this once and say yes without asking all the questions that are running through your mind right now." The registrar cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual tension in the room and the obvious undercurrents of conflict and fear that surrounded what should have been a joyful occasion. "Perhaps we should discuss the details of this ceremony privately. Away from—" "No," said the shorter of the two men, speaking for the first time since entering the room. His voice carried an authority that made everyone freeze, the sort of command presence that came from years of being obeyed without question. "The ceremony can proceed exactly as planned. We're simply here to ensure that all parties understand the full implications of their choices." The words were polite enough on the surface, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a directive from people who were accustomed to having their wishes carried out without argument or delay. Tom's grip on Aroha's hand tightened until it was almost painful. "Say yes," he whispered, and in his voice was a plea so desperate that it overrode every logical objection her mind was frantically raising. Please, Aroha, for Nikora's sake, if not for your own, say yes and trust me to explain everything later. Through the window, the afternoon light was beginning to fade as the promised storm clouds gathered over the Waikato region, casting long shadows across the hospital room and giving everything an ominous theatrical quality. Somewhere in the distance she could hear thunder rumbling, and Aroha realized that this moment, this impossible, terrifying, completely mad moment, was the pivot point upon which her entire future would turn. The registrar opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency and withdrew the necessary papers, his movements quick and businesslike, despite the highly unusual circumstances surrounding this ceremony. The documents he produced were official marriage certificates, complete with the New Zealand government seal, but something about the speed with which he'd procured them suggested this ceremony had been planned well in advance. Do you, Aroha Kairau, take this man, Tamaya Hatherwick, to be your lawfully wedded husband? The registrar asked, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times, though probably never under circumstances quite like these. Aroha looked at Tom, really looked at him for the first time since this surreal afternoon had begun, and tried to see past the simple clothes and weathered hands to the man beneath. There was something in his eyes that spoke of protection offered at enormous personal cost, of sacrifice that went far beyond anything she could understand, of a love that had somehow bloomed in the impossible space between one heartbeat and the next. She thought of Nikora, still clutching the expensive headphones that had saved his sanity and possibly his life, and of the surveillance photographs that proved their quiet existence had already been shattered by forces beyond their control. She thought of her late husband, James, and the promise she'd made at his deathbed to protect their son no matter what the cost. She thought of the two men whose very presence in this room seemed to promise that her choices had been narrowed down to this single moment of trust or rejection. The thunder outside grew closer, and rain began spattering against the window with increasing intensity. In the distance, she could hear the sound of the hospital's emergency generators starting up, preparing for the power fluctuations that often accompanied Waikato storms. The room seemed to contract around them, becoming smaller and more intimate, as if the entire world had shrunk down to this single decision that would echo through the rest of their lives. Yes, she whispered, and the words seemed to resonate through the room like a bell tolling the hour. It was more than acceptance of a marriage proposal. It was acceptance of whatever destiny had brought Tom into her life, whatever protection he was offering, whatever price would eventually come due for this moment of salvation. The word sealed more than a marriage. It sealed her fate, their fate, binding them together in ways that neither of them could fully comprehend. The registrar continued with the ceremony, his voice becoming a distant murmur as Aroha realized she had just stepped across a threshold from which there could be no return. As Tom slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that appeared from nowhere, as if he had been carrying it in anticipation of this moment, she caught a glimpse of the shorter man in the wool coat checking something on his phone and nodding with satisfaction. Whatever they had wanted to happen had just occurred, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just become a player in a game whose rules she didn't understand, with stakes that had yet to be revealed. But when Tom kissed her gently, sealing their improvised vows, she felt something unexpected bloom in her chest, not just gratitude or relief, but the beginning of something that might, against all odds and logic, actually be love. And perhaps in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined, that would be enough to see them through whatever came next. 2 weeks had passed since the surreal hospital wedding that had bound Aroha's fate to Tom's in ways she was only beginning to understand. The autumn air in Te Awamutu carried the crisp promise of winter, and the late afternoon sky had taken on that particular lilac hue that made the Waikato countryside look like something from a fairy tale. It was the kind of evening that should have been perfect for a wedding celebration. And despite everything, the strange circumstances, the watching eyes, the unanswered questions that multiplied like weeds in her mind, Aroha found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. They had decided to have a proper ceremony this time, something that felt real and chosen rather than desperate and forced. The Te Awamutu Community Center had been decorated with simple white flowers and fairy lights that cast a warm glow over the modest gathering of friends and neighbors who had come to celebrate their union. Mrs. Patterson from the corner dairy had brought her famous pavlova, The Henderson family had contributed a case of Steinlager, and even gruff old Mr. Mackenzie from the hardware store had shown up wearing his best suit and a surprisingly genuine smile. The civil official, a kindly woman in her 60s named Margaret, who had been marrying couples in the Waikato for over 30 years, conducted the ceremony with warmth and dignity that made the previous hospital ordeal feel like a bad dream. Tom wore a simple black suit that somehow managed to make him look both more handsome and more mysterious, whilst Aroha had chosen a cream-colored dress that had belonged to her mother. Something old, something borrowed, something that connected her to the family traditions that had sustained her through the darkest times. Nikora stood beside them as ring-bearer, proudly wearing his best clothes and the noise-dampening headphones that had become his constant companions. The boy seemed genuinely happy for the first time in months, his green eyes bright with excitement as he carefully carried the simple gold bands that would make this union official in the eyes of their community, as well as the law. The reception had spilled out into Victoria Park, where a makeshift band, 3 farmers with guitars and a retired schoolteacher on keyboard, played a mix of classic Kiwi songs and gentle instrumentals that created the perfect soundtrack for an evening that felt like stepping into a different, better life. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the soft conversations of people genuinely pleased to see 2 lonely souls find each other in this small corner of the world. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off Lake Karapiro in the distance, the band struck up the opening chords of Pokarekare Ana, that hauntingly beautiful Maori love song that never failed to move even the most hardened hearts. Tom took Aroha's hand and led her onto the improvised dance floor, a patch of grass beneath a canopy of fairy lights that transformed their simple park into something magical. Ehine hoki mai rā, Tom sang softly in her ear as they swayed together, his voice carrying the melody with surprising skill. His accent when speaking to Reo was perfect, suggesting a familiarity with Maori culture that went deeper than the casual exposure most Pakeha New Zealanders had. Kamadea hawi te arohai. Aroha looked up at him in surprise. You speak te reo? My grandmother was Ngati Tuharetoa, Tom replied, his eyes holding secrets that seemed to stretch back generations. She made sure I understood where I came from, even when the rest of the world tried to make me forget. It was another piece of the puzzle that was Tom Hatherwick, another layer of complexity beneath the simple farmer exterior. But before Aroha could ask more questions, she noticed something that made her blood run cold, and her heart skip several beats. Beyond the edge of the park, where the streetlights cast long shadows between the oak trees that lined Te Awamutu's main road, a white van sat motionless. It was the same model she remembered from the market, though she couldn't be entirely certain it was the same vehicle. What made her stomach clench with fear was the way it seemed positioned for optimal observation of their celebration, and the fact that someone was clearly sitting in the driver's seat watching. Tom, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music and laughter surrounding them. That van by the road. Tom's eyes followed her gaze, and she felt his body tense against hers, his grip on her hand tightening protectively. I see it, he murmured, his voice carrying a grimness that confirmed her worst fears. We need to get everyone away from here. Now. But before they could take any action, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Nikora, who had been playing happily with some of the other children near the makeshift playground equipment, suddenly let out a cry of pure delight as a bright red balloon escaped from his grasp and began floating upward into the darkening sky. The balloon, heart-shaped and shiny with the words "Just Married" printed in silver script, caught the last rays of sunlight as it rose higher and higher, becoming a tiny dot of color against the purple twilight. The children cheered and clapped, pointing upward as it disappeared into the gathering darkness, carrying with it their innocent wishes for happiness and love. It should have been a moment of simple joy, a perfect end to a perfect evening. But as Aroha watched her son chase after the balloon's fading form, running towards the edge of the park with the single-minded focus that characterized his autism, she saw something that turned her blood to ice water in her veins. The white van's engine had started. She could see the exhaust visible in the cool evening air, and the vehicle was beginning to move slowly along the road, keeping pace with Nikora's enthusiastic pursuit of the escaped balloon. Nikora! She called out, but her voice was lost in the noise of the celebration. The band was reaching the crescendo of Pokarekare Ana, and the guests were singing along with the kind of alcohol-fueled enthusiasm that made individual voices impossible to distinguish. Tom was already moving, pushing through the crowd with a speed and determination that scattered surprised guests like bowling pins. Aroha followed, her cream dress catching on chairs and decorations as she struggled to keep up, her heart pounding with a fear that went far beyond normal parental anxiety. By the time they reached the edge of the park, Nikora had disappeared. The red balloon floated alone in the field beyond the playground, caught on a fence post and deflating slowly like a dying dream. The white van was nowhere to be seen, but tire marks in the soft earth suggested it had stopped, waited, and then departed with frightening efficiency. "Nikora!" Aroha screamed, her voice cracking with terror as she ran towards the fence line, stumbling in her wedding shoes and tearing her mother's dress on the barbed wire. "Nikora, where are you?" Tom was beside her instantly, his farmer's flashlight cutting through the growing darkness as they searched the area where their son had last been seen. Other guests had noticed the commotion and were beginning to spread out across the field, calling Nikora's name and forming an impromptu search party that covered more ground with each passing minute. It was Mrs. Patterson who found them first. Not Nikora, but the items that proved their worst fears had been realized. Lying in the grass near the deflated balloon were the noise-dampening headphones that had become Nikora's lifeline to the world. Carefully placed as if someone had wanted them to be discovered quickly, beneath the headphones was a piece of paper, folded with precise creases and weighted down with a small stone to prevent it from blowing away. Tom opened it with hands that trembled despite his obvious efforts to remain calm, and Aroha saw his face go white as he read the contents. "What does it say?" she demanded, though part of her already knew that whatever was written there would change everything, would transform this perfect evening into the beginning of a nightmare that might never end. Tom's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely recognizable, hoarse with rage and fear in equal measure. "It says, you must be willing to pay, and there's a phone number." The band had stopped playing. The guests had fallen silent, sensing that something terrible had happened but not yet understanding the full scope of the disaster. In the distance, sirens were beginning to wail as someone, probably Margaret, the celebrant, who had dealt with enough family crises to recognize one unfolding, had called the police. Aroha sank to her knees in the grass beside the abandoned headphones, her wedding dress staining with mud and tears, as the reality of the situation crashed over her like a wave. Their beautiful evening, their chance at happiness, their hope for a normal life, all of it had been an illusion. A brief moment of peace before the storm that had been building since that first day at the market finally broke over their heads. Tom knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms as the first police cars arrived with flashing lights that turned the park into a surreal crime scene. "We'll get him back," he whispered fiercely, but Aroha could hear the uncertainty beneath his determination. "Whatever they want, whatever it costs, we'll get him back." But as the night deepened and the search team spread out across Teawamutu, Aroha couldn't shake the feeling that the price for Nikora's return would be higher than either of them could imagine, and that the man she had just married was hiding secrets that might be the key to their son's fate, or the reason he had been taken in the first place. The red balloon, now completely deflated, lay forgotten in the grass like a broken promise, whilst somewhere in the darkness, her 8-year-old son was learning what it meant to be truly alone for the first time in his life. And Aroha knew, with the terrible certainty that comes to mothers in their darkest hours, that this was only the beginning of an ordeal that would test every bond they had formed and every assumption they had made about the man who had sworn to protect them both. The clock on Tom's kitchen wall ticked with merciless precision as the hours crawled past midnight, each second marking time that Nikora spent in the hands of strangers. The small weatherboard house in Matangi, 15 minutes outside Hamilton, felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode as Aroha paced the worn linoleum floor, whilst Tom systematically demolished every drawer and cupboard in his desperate search for something that might help them meet the kidnappers' demands. The wedding dress hung torn and muddy on the back of a chair, a tragic reminder of how quickly their brief moment of happiness had been shattered. Aroha had changed into jeans and one of Tom's oversized flannel shirts, but she couldn't stop her hands from shaking every time she thought about Nikora alone somewhere in the darkness, probably terrified and confused, unable to understand why the safe world she had tried so hard to build around him had suddenly collapsed. The house itself was a study in contradictions that only added to Aroha's growing confusion about the man she had married. The furniture was modest and well-worn, a sagging couch covered with a hand-knitted throw, a dining table scarred by years of use, kitchen appliances that belonged to the previous decade. Everything spoke of careful economy, of someone who lived within modest means and made every dollar count. But scattered throughout were details that didn't fit the picture. a sound system that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes on agricultural science and international finance, and in the corner of the living room a laptop computer that looked like something a tech executive would carry. "There has to be something," Tom muttered, pulling papers from a filing cabinet with increasing desperation. "Bank statements, account numbers, anything that proves I have access to the kind of money they're demanding." He had been on the phone for the past 2 hours, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to people whose names Aroha didn't recognize. The conversations were cryptic, filled with references to frozen assets and judicial holds and trust fund restrictions that painted a picture of wealth tied up in legal complications she couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Tom's laptop came to life with a soft chime that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the kitchen. The screen displayed a banking portal that made Aroha's eyes widen in disbelief, not because she understood all the financial terminology, but because even she could recognize the significance of numbers that large. The account balance showed figures that her mind struggled to process. 47,832,156, 23 NZD in the primary holding account, with additional subsidiary accounts that contained amounts that dwarfed anything she had ever imagined. This wasn't the savings account of a successful farmer or even a wealthy business owner. This was the kind of generational wealth that shaped entire communities, that could fund hospitals and schools and change the economic landscape of small towns. "My God, Tom," she whispered, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs as the full scope of his deception became clear. "Who are you? What are you?" Tom's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, but his face grew increasingly pale as screen after screen displayed the same message. "Account access restricted. Contact legal department for authorization." Every attempt to transfer funds, even relatively small amounts, triggered security protocols that demanded documentation and approval from lawyers whose offices were currently closed for the weekend. "I am the sole beneficiary of the Hatherwick Pastoral Holdings Trust," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of shame and bitter frustration. "My great-grandfather established it in 1923 when he bought up half the dairy farms in the Waikato during the Depression. By the time my father died, it was worth more than the GDP of some small countries." He turned to face Aroha, and she saw in his eyes the weight of secrets that had been crushing him for longer than she could imagine. "But I can't touch any of it. Not a bloody cent. The trust is under investigation for tax evasion and land fraud going back 70 years. Every account is frozen pending the outcome of litigation that could take years to resolve." The laptop screen flickered as Tom attempted another transfer, and once again the system locked him out with polite but firm refusal. The irony was devastating. Surrounded by more wealth than most people could dream of, but unable to access a single dollar when his stepson's life hung in the balance, a new fissure opened in Aroha's already fragile trust as she began to understand the full scope of what Tom had been hiding from her. The modest farmhouse, the simple clothes, the calloused hands, all of it was an elaborate performance designed to hide the fact that he was heir to one of New Zealand's largest agricultural fortunes. But worse than the deception was the growing realization that his wealth, rather than being their salvation, might be the very reason Nicara had been taken. "They know about the trust," she said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Those men at the market, the surveillance photos, the way they seem to be waiting for us. They've been watching you, haven't they? They know exactly what you're worth and exactly why you can't pay them." Tom's silence was answer enough. He slumped against the kitchen counter, looking older than his 37 years, worn down by the weight of a legacy he had never wanted and couldn't escape. The laptop continued to display its mocking messages about frozen assets and legal restrictions, digital barriers that might as well have been prison walls for all the good they did. It was then that the phone rang. Not Tom's mobile, but the old landline that hung on the kitchen wall like a relic from a simpler time. The sound was shrill and urgent in the midnight silence, cutting through their despair like a knife. Tom answered on the second ring, his voice carefully controlled despite the fear that was clearly eating him alive. "Hello?" The voice that came through the speaker was distorted, electronically altered to make identification impossible, but the words were crystal clear and designed for maximum psychological impact. "Mr. Hatherwick, or should I say Mr. Trust Fund, having trouble accessing your accounts?" There was cruel amusement in the synthetic voice, the satisfaction of predators who had been planning this moment for a long time. $20 million, New Zealand currency. "You have 48 hours to liquidate whatever assets you need to liquidate. Call in whatever favors you need to call in, and transfer the money to the account number we're about to send you." Tom put the call on speaker so Aroha could hear, and she watched his face go white as the voice continued with clinical precision. "To prove that we're serious about our deadline, and to demonstrate the consequences of noncompliance." The pause that followed seemed to stretch for eternity, filled with the kind of silence that precedes devastation. Then, cutting through the electronic distortion, came a sound that stopped Aroha's heart. Nikora's voice, high and frightened, calling for his mom with the kind of desperation that only a child in mortal terror could produce. Mom, where are you? I want to come home, please, I want to come home." The cry was followed by a sharp sound, something that might have been a slap or the crack of breaking plastic, and then Nikora's voice again. But this time it was different, higher, more strained, edged with the kind of pain that no 8-year-old should ever have to experience. "The next sound you hear," the distorted voice continued with conversational calm, "might be scissors, or it might be something else. You have 48 hours, Mr. Hatherwick. The clock is ticking, and little boys who cry too much sometimes have accidents." The line went dead, leaving Tom and Aroha staring at each other across the kitchen table, whilst the laptop screen continued to mock them with its displays of inaccessible wealth. Somewhere in the darkness of the Waikato countryside, their son was learning what it meant to be truly helpless, whilst they sat surrounded by enough money to buy a small country but unable to spend a single cent of it. A new message appeared on the laptop screen. An email with banking details and a countdown timer that had begun at 47 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. The numbers ticked downward with mechanical precision, marking time that Nikora couldn't afford to lose whilst his parents sat in a kitchen filled with the ghosts of wealth that had become their curse rather than their salvation. Tom reached across the table and took Aroha's hand, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers, the fear that he was trying so hard to hide behind a facade of determination. "We'll find a way," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be a way to break through the legal restrictions, to access enough money to meet their demands." But as the clock on the wall ticked past 1 in the morning and the countdown timer on the laptop continued its relentless march toward 0, Aroha couldn't shake the feeling that they were trapped in a nightmare designed by people who understood exactly how to exploit their greatest vulnerabilities. The kidnappers knew about the frozen trust fund, knew about the legal complications that made Tom's wealth untouchable, and they had taken Nikora anyway, which meant they either had a plan that accounted for these obstacles, or they were never planning to return him at all. The sound of Nikora's frightened voice echoed in her memory, and Aroha realized that the next 47 hours would determine not just whether they could save their son, but whether the love that had brought them together would survive the crucible of secrets, lies, and impossible choices that lay ahead. 20 hours had evaporated from the countdown timer when desperation drove Aroha to do something she had sworn she would never do: return to the house where she had lived with her late husband, James, a place she had abandoned after his death because the memories were too painful to bear. The small cottage on the outskirts of Teawamutu stood exactly as she had left it 18 months ago, weathered and lonely, surrounded by overgrown gardens that had once been James's pride and joy. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the front door that stuck from disuse and stepped into a tomb of memories that hit her like a physical blow. Everything was exactly as she had left it in her grief-stricken flight. James's coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter, his work boots by the back door, his reading glasses folded on the table beside his favorite chair. The house smelled of dust and neglect, but underneath it all was the faint scent of the aftershave he had worn, a ghost that made her heart clench with fresh pain. She went directly to the bedroom that had once been their sanctuary, to the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed where James had kept his most important papers. Her hands shook as she lifted the heavy lid, revealing documents and photographs that told the story of their life together: their marriage certificate, Nikora's birth certificate, insurance policies, and there, beneath a layer of family photos, the manila envelope she'd been looking for. Inside the envelope were bank statements and receipts that painted a picture she had never fully understood during James's lifetime. Regular deposits, always in even amounts, always from the same source: Hatherwick Pastoral Service Trust, $200,000, transferred in monthly installments over the course of 3 years, all of it designated with the cryptic notation, Future Security NK. The initials were Nikora's, but the amounts were staggering for a family that had always lived modestly. James had been a mechanic at the local garage, earning enough to keep them comfortable but never wealthy. Where had this money come from? And why had he never told her about it? More disturbing still, why had the payments stopped exactly 1 week before his sudden heart attack? On the back of one of the deposit slips, she found something that made her blood run cold. A handwritten note in James's careful script, to ensure Nicora's future. Regardless of what happens to me, the boy must never know the truth about his father's family. Nicora's father's family. But James was Nicora's father, wasn't he? Aroha sank onto the bed that had once been theirs, her mind reeling as she tried to process implications that threatened to destroy everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her son. With shaking hands, she grabbed her mobile and dialed Tom's number. But before she could speak, she heard the sound of metal scraping against metal from somewhere outside the house. Heart pounding. She crept to the bedroom window and peered through the dusty curtains to see a sight that made her stomach lurch with terror. Scarlett Hatherwick, a woman Aroha had never met but recognized instantly from the family photographs Tom kept hidden in his desk drawer, was methodically attaching heavy padlocks to the gate of the cottage's front fence. Scarlett was tall and elegant, with platinum blonde hair cut in a severe bob and the kind of expensive clothes that marked her as someone accustomed to wealth and power. But there was something predatory in her movements, something that suggested she took pleasure in this violation of Aroha's private space. Aroha had seen this woman in the background of Tom's family photos, always standing slightly apart from the others, always watching rather than participating. Tom had mentioned her only once, describing her as his older sister who handled the business side of things for the trust. But seeing her here now, in the aftermath of Nicora's kidnapping, suggested a connection that went far deeper than simple family complications. Not daring to make a sound, Aroha slipped out the back door and crept around the side of the house, keeping low behind the overgrown hedge that separated her property from the neighbors. From this vantage point, she could see Scarlett clearly as she finished securing the gate and then pulled out an expensive-looking mobile phone. "The property is secured," Scarlett said, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Her accent was crisp and educated, with the sort of refined pronunciation that spoke of private schools and international travel. "She won't be coming back here again without our permission." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the call, and then her laugh, cold and humorless, sent ice through Aroha's veins. "Oh, she'll sign the papers. They always do when their children are involved. Tom's always been too sentimental for this business, but blood tells in the end. He'll do what needs to be done." Scarlett ended the call and walked to a silver BMW that Aroha hadn't noticed before, parked just down the road where it wouldn't be immediately visible from the house. But before getting into the car, she did something that made Aroha's blood boil with rage. She deliberately walked through James's vegetable garden, crushing the self-seeded plants that had somehow survived 18 months of neglect, destroying the last living remnants of her late husband's care and love. As the BMW disappeared down the rural road, Aroha remained hidden behind the hedge, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. Scarlett had keys to her property. How was that possible? She had spoken about papers that needed signing, about Tom doing what needs to be done, about children being used as leverage to force compliance, and most disturbing of all, she had referred to this business as if Nicora's kidnapping was just another corporate transaction. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and her heart nearly stopped as she read the contents. "Your late husband understood the importance of family loyalty. The barn behind your house contains documents that explain everything. You have 1 hour to retrieve them before we make them permanently unavailable." The barn. Aroha had barely thought about the old wooden structure since James's death, but now she remembered how he had spent hours there in the months before he died, always locking it carefully when he finished whatever project occupied his time. She had assumed it was just another of his mechanical hobbies, restoring old engines or building furniture. But what if it had been something else entirely? The barn was secured with a combination lock that she had never known the code for, but desperation gave her inspiration. She tried James's birthday, then hers, then Nicora's. Nothing. Then on impulse, she tried the date of their wedding anniversary, and the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Inside, the barn was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of tools and mechanical projects, she found what appeared to be a private office, complete with filing cabinets, a computer desk, and walls covered with photographs and documents that made her legs give way beneath her. The photographs showed Tom at various ages from childhood through adulthood. But they weren't family snapshots. They were surveillance photos, taken with telephoto lenses, and organized chronologically like a case file. Some showed him at school, others at university, still others at various business meetings and social events. Every significant moment of his life had been documented, cataloged, studied, but it was the documents that truly shattered her understanding of reality. Birth certificates, DNA test results, legal papers that painted a picture so shocking she had to read them 3 times before their meaning sank in. Nikora wasn't James's biological son, he was Tom's. The DNA evidence was conclusive, the dates unmistakable. James had known, had agreed to raise the boy as his own, had accepted monthly payments from the Hatherwick Trust to ensure Nikora's security and education. There was more. Correspondence between James and various lawyers, discussing something called the succession clause and bloodline requirements, and trust beneficiary protocols. It became clear that Nikora wasn't just Tom's son, he was Tom's heir, the next in line to inherit the vast Hatherwick fortune when he came of age. But the most devastating revelation came in a letter written in James's handwriting, dated just 1 week before his death. "I can't continue to be part of this deception. Aroha has the right to know the truth about her son's heritage, and Nikora deserves to grow up knowing his real father. I'm going to tell them everything, regardless of the consequences to the trust or the family's plans." James had been planning to reveal the truth about Nikora's parentage, and 1 week later he was dead of a sudden heart attack that had baffled doctors because of his excellent health and lack of risk factors. Aroha's hands shook as she photographed every document with her phone, her mind reeling with implications that grew more terrifying with each revelation. Nikora hadn't been kidnapped randomly. He had been taken because he was the key to unlocking the Hatherwick fortune, the biological heir whose existence threatened to upset carefully laid plans that had been decades in the making. Her phone rang, startling her so badly that she nearly dropped it. Tom's voice was desperate, strained with exhaustion and fear. "Aroha, where are you? The police have been trying to reach you and we need to—" "I know who Nikora really is," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know why they took him, and I know why James died." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that she thought the call had been disconnected. When Tom finally spoke, his voice was hollow, defeated. "You found the barn. You knew," she said, "and it wasn't a question. You've always known that Nikora is your son, and you let me believe that James was his father. You let me marry you without telling me that my son is the heir to your family's fortune. You let me walk into this nightmare blind. Aroha, please." "No," she said, cutting him off as rage and betrayal warred with the desperate need to save Nikora, regardless of whose blood ran in his veins. "We'll talk about this later. Right now I need to know, is there any way to use Nikora's status as your heir to access the trust funds? Can we save him by proving his identity?" Tom's answer came slowly, weighted with a despair that seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. "That's exactly what they're counting on. The succession clause requires DNA verification and legal documentation that could take weeks to process. And once Nikora is officially recognized as my heir," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Aroha understood with sickening clarity that once Nikora's true parentage was legally established, he would become an even more valuable target for anyone willing to exploit a child to access generational wealth. The kidnappers weren't just demanding ransom. They were forcing Tom to choose between saving his son's life and preserving his son's future. As she stood in the barn surrounded by evidence of a deception that had shaped her entire adult life, Aroha realized that the next few hours would determine not just whether they could rescue Nikora, but whether any of them would survive the dangerous game of secrets and lies that had been playing out around them since long before she even knew Tom existed. The countdown timer on her phone showed 18 hours remaining, and somewhere in the darkness her son, Tom's son, was waiting for salvation that might come at a price none of them could afford to pay. The dawn of the second day broke gray and ominous over the Waikato River. With storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an army preparing for battle, Tom had not slept for 36 hours, and the weight of secrets finally revealed hung around his shoulders like chains, forged from decades of deception and family guilt. The countdown timer on his laptop showed less than 12 hours remaining, and conventional solutions had proven as elusive as morning mist. It was Aroha who suggested the desperate gambit that would either save Nikora or destroy what remained of Tom's carefully constructed life. "The marae," she said, her voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. "If you truly want to make this right, if you want to honor the truth about your family's history, then do it properly. Do it in front of the people your family wronged, in a place where lies can't survive. Tom understood immediately what she was proposing, and the magnitude of it made his hands shake as he reached for his phone. Ngati Mahanga Marae wasn't just a cultural center. It was the heart of the iwi whose ancestral lands had been systematically purchased, traded, and in some cases simply taken by the Hatherwick family over 3 generations. The wealth that had built his trust fund was rooted in soil that had been sacred to these people for centuries, before his great-grandfather had arrived with legal documents and promises that were never intended to be kept. The call to the marae took courage that Tom didn't know he possessed. Cora Williams, the elderly Kaumatua who answered, listened in silence as Tom explained who he was and what he needed to do. The old man's breathing was audible over the phone line, heavy with the weight of history and hurt that stretched back nearly a century. "You want to come to our marae?" Cora Williams said finally, his voice carrying the dignity of someone who had seen too much injustice to be surprised by anything. "To confess crimes that your Wanao committed against mine, in front of television cameras and newspaper reporters because your son has been taken by people who know your family's shame." "Yes, Coro," Tom replied, using the respectful term that acknowledged the elder's status. "And I want to pledge restitution, $20 million to the Iwi Trust, and permanent return of the ancestral lands that my great-grandfather should never have been allowed to purchase." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute, filled with the ghosts of conversations that should have happened decades ago. Apologies that should have been offered when they might have healed rather than merely acknowledged wounds that had festered for generations. "Come then," Cora Williams said at last. "Come and face what your family has done. But understand this, Mokopuna. Once you speak these truths in our sacred space, before our people and yours, there will be no taking them back. The consequences will follow you for the rest of your life." By mid-morning, word had spread through the Waikato region's Maori communities like wildfire. The heir to the Hatherwick fortune was coming to Ngati Mahanga Marae to make public confession and offer reparations for historical injustices. Television news trucks arrived before Tom and Aroha did, their satellite dishes and camera crews transforming the peaceful marae into a media circus that would broadcast this moment across New Zealand and potentially around the world. But there were others in the growing crowd whose presence was more significant than any journalist. Elderly Maori men and women, some using walking sticks, some helped by younger family members, came to witness what many of them had never expected to see in their lifetimes: a member of the Hatherwick family taking responsibility for the harm that had been done to their people. Tom arrived wearing a simple black suit, but he had asked Aroha to help him prepare in the traditional way. She had woven harakeke into a small korowai that draped over his shoulders, and she had helped him practice the haka that he would perform as part of his confession. Not the tourist version that visitors saw at cultural shows, but the haka of penitence that was reserved for moments of profound spiritual significance. The atea, the open space in front of the Warnui, was packed with people by the time Tom took his position in the center of the gathering. Television cameras recorded every movement as he knelt on the grass that had been watered by generations of tears, both of joy and sorrow, and began to speak in a voice that carried clearly across the assembled crowd. "Ko Tamaya Hatherwick Ahau," he began in Te Reo Maori, his pronunciation careful and respectful. "I am Tamaya Hatherwick, great-grandson of William Hatherwick, and I have come to confess the sins of my Wanao against the Tangata Wenua of this place." The haka that followed was unlike anything most of the crowd had ever witnessed. This wasn't a performance or a display of cultural appreciation. It was a ritual of confession that called upon ancestral spirits to witness truth-telling and judge the sincerity of repentance. Tom's movements were precise but filled with genuine emotion, his voice cracking as he recited the wrongs that his family had committed against the iwi. He spoke of land purchased for a fraction of its value from people who didn't understand the legal implications of the documents they were signing. He spoke of water rights diverted to serve dairy farms whilst traditional food sources dried up. He spoke of sacred sites bulldozed to make way for milking sheds, of burial grounds disturbed by farm machinery, of a culture systematically undermined by the relentless expansion of an agricultural empire that treated people as obstacles to profit. The microphone system had been set up by the local radio station, and Tom's words carried across the marae with crystal clarity that left no room for misunderstanding or misinterpretation. But then, just as he reached the most crucial part of his confession, the formal acknowledgement of specific lands that would be returned to iwi control, the sound system failed with a sharp squeal of electronic feedback. For several seconds that felt like eternity. The only sound was the wind moving through the ancient trees that surrounded the marae. The crowd held its collective breath, unsure whether this was technical malfunction or something more ominous. Some of the elderly Maori present nodded knowingly, interpreting the silence as a sign that the ancestors were listening, that this moment had spiritual significance beyond the merely political. When the sound returned, Tom's voice was stronger, more determined, as if the interruption had been a test that he had passed. I pledged $20 million to the Ngāti Mahanga Trust for education, healthcare, and cultural preservation. I pledged the return of the 3,400 hectares of ancestral land currently held by Hatherwick Pastoral Holdings, and I pledge that my son, Nikora, will be raised to understand and honor his Maori heritage, regardless of what happens to me. The mention of Nikora sent a ripple through the crowd, because many of them had heard about the kidnapping on the morning news. The connection between Tom's public confession and his son's disappearance was becoming clear. This wasn't just about historical justice, it was about a father's desperate attempt to save his child by sacrificing everything his family had built through exploitation and deception. The haka concluded with Tom prostrating himself completely on the grass, his forehead touching the earth whilst tears streamed down his face. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of police sirens approaching from the direction of the main road. Cora Williams stepped forward to offer the traditional response to Tom's confession. But before he could speak, police vehicles surrounded the marae with flashing lights and uniformed officers who moved with the efficiency of people executing pre-planned arrests. Detective Inspector Sarah Mackenzie, a tall woman with prematurely gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen everything in her 20-year career, approached Tom with handcuffs already in her hand. "Tomaya Hatherwick," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. "You are under arrest for tax evasion, fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. These charges have been filed by your sister, Scarlett Hatherwick, acting as trustee of the Hatherwick Pastoral Holdings Trust." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Tom's public confession, his offer of restitution, his desperate attempt to save his son by acknowledging historical wrongs, all of it was being used against him by his own family. Scarlett had waited for him to incriminate himself in front of witnesses and cameras before triggering the legal trap that would remove him from the equation entirely. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Tom's wrists, Aroha's phone buzzed with an incoming message. The text was brief but devastating. "GPS coordinates attached. You have 60 minutes to reach the location alone. Bring proof that you are now sole guardian of the Hatherwick heir. Any police involvement will result in permanent consequences." The coordinates led to an abandoned dairy processing plant on the banks of the Waikato River, a facility that had been closed for 5 years, but was still owned by a subsidiary company controlled by the Hatherwick Trust. As Tom was led away in handcuffs, broadcast live to television audiences across New Zealand, Aroha realized that his sister had orchestrated everything from the beginning: the kidnapping, the impossible demands, the public confession that would destroy Tom's credibility and legal standing. All of it had been designed to clear the way for Scarlett to claim control of both the family fortune and the heir who represented its future. The crowd at the marae watched in stunned silence as the police vehicles departed, carrying Tom toward a fate that none of them could predict. But Cora Williams stepped forward to address Aroha directly, his voice carrying the authority of generations of spiritual leadership. "The confession has been heard," he said simply. "The promises made in this sacred place will be honored, regardless of what happens to the man who made them. That is the way of our people. We hold truth above convenience and justice above law." As Aroha raced toward her car to follow the GPS coordinates to what might be Nikora's location, she carried with her the knowledge that whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just her son's fate, but whether the cycle of injustice and exploitation that had defined the Hatherwick legacy would finally be broken, or whether it would claim another generation of victims in its relentless pursuit of wealth and power. The abandoned Waikato Valley dairy processing plant loomed against the gray afternoon sky, like a monument to industrial decay and broken promises. Aroha's hands shook on the steering wheel as she followed the GPS coordinates through increasingly desolate farmland, past rusted gates and warning signs that spoke of environmental hazards and structural instability. The facility had been closed since 2019, following a contamination scandal that had destroyed the company's reputation and left the massive complex to rot beside the Waikato River. The main building was a brutalist concrete structure that had once processed millions of liters of milk daily, transforming the liquid gold of New Zealand agriculture into export products that fed families around the world. Now its broken windows stared blindly across abandoned loading docks where trucks had once queued to collect their precious cargo. Weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt, and graffiti covered the lower walls with angry messages about corporate greed and environmental destruction. Aroha parked her car beside a sign that warned of asbestos contamination and structural collapse, her heart pounding as she realized this place had been chosen specifically for its isolation and danger. No one would think to look for a kidnapped child in a facility that had been condemned and abandoned, and if something went wrong, the building's instability would provide perfect cover for any number of accidents. She found the entrance exactly where the GPS coordinates had indicated, a service door on the eastern side of the building that had been propped open with a concrete block. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed ceiling tiles, lit only by the pale light filtering through broken skylights high above. The air smelled of mold and chemicals, and every step echoed through empty corridors that had once buzzed with the activity of hundreds of workers. Following the sound of voices deeper into the facility, Aroha found herself in what had once been the main processing floor, a cavernous space dominated by massive stainless steel tanks and conveyance systems that looked like the skeleton of some mechanical dinosaur. It was here, in the shadows between industrial equipment that would never run again, that she found Nicola. Her 8-year-old son was sitting on the concrete floor beside one of the old mixing tanks, his wrists bound with zip ties and his legs shackled to a heavy chain that prevented him from moving more than a few meters in any direction. He looked smaller than she remembered, fragile and frightened in a way that made her maternal instincts scream with rage and protective fury. His clothes were dirty and torn, and there were marks on his arms that suggested he had struggled against his restraints until exhaustion and despair had overtaken him. But it was the sight of Scarlett Hatherwick that truly made Aroha's blood boil with hatred. Tom's sister stood beside a collection of rusted oil drums that bore warning symbols for toxic chemicals, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the industrial setting, her expensive clothing protected by a designer raincoat that probably cost more than Aroha's monthly income. She looked like someone attending a business meeting rather than orchestrating a kidnapping, and her calm demeanor made her seem infinitely more dangerous than any common criminal. "Mrs. Hatherwick," Scarlett said with mock politeness, her refined accent echoing off the concrete walls. "Or should I say Mrs. Kairau? I understand there's some confusion about your legal status, given that your marriage to my brother was based on rather significant omissions of truth." Scarlett gestured toward a metal table that had been set up near the chemical drums, its surface covered with legal documents and a laptop computer that displayed what appeared to be banking transfer screens. "I have a proposition that will resolve everyone's problems in a manner that serves the best interests of all parties involved." "Where are the kidnappers?" Aroha demanded, her voice echoing through the empty facility. "Where are the people who took my son?" Scarlett's laugh was cultured and cold, the sort of amusement that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than abandoned factories. "Oh, my dear, there never were any kidnappers. At least, not in the conventional sense. This entire situation has been what business people call a managed restructuring of assets and relationships." The implications of Scarlett's words hit Aroha like a physical blow. "You took him. You took Nicola yourself. I facilitated his temporary relocation to a secure environment, while certain legal complications were resolved," Scarlett corrected, with the sort of euphemistic language that made kidnapping sound like a corporate personnel transfer. "My brother's unfortunate attachment to romantic sentiment and historical guilt was threatening to destabilize decades of careful financial planning. Sometimes family members require guidance to make decisions that serve the greater good." Scarlett walked over to where Nicola sat chained, her expensive heels clicking against the concrete floor with mechanical precision. "This child represents the future of the Hatherwick legacy, billions of dollars in agricultural assets, land holdings, and investment portfolios that have been built over 4 generations. Tom's naive plans to give it all away to assuage his misplaced guilt would have destroyed everything our family has worked to achieve." She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with wax, holding it out toward Aroha like a peace offering. "Inside this envelope are the original land deeds that granted my great-grandfather legal ownership of the territories he purchased from various Maori iwi between 1923 and 1947. Academic historians and activist lawyers have spent decades trying to prove that these transactions were fraudulent or coercive, but they've never been able to access the primary documents that would support their claims. Aroha stared at the envelope, understanding instinctively that whatever it contained represented the key to everything: the source of the Hatherwick wealth, the evidence of historical injustices, and potentially the leverage needed to secure Nicora's freedom. "The proposition is simple," Scarlett continued, setting the envelope on the metal table beside the legal documents. "You burn these papers here and now in front of witnesses who can testify that the evidence of any historical irregularities has been permanently destroyed. In exchange, Nicora is released, you receive a settlement of $5 million for your cooperation, and my brother serves a minimal sentence for tax irregularities before returning to private life as a gentleman farmer, with no legal claim to the trust assets." The offer was delivered with the sort of clinical detachment that made it clear Scarlett viewed this entire situation as a business negotiation rather than a mother's desperate attempt to save her child. "The alternative is that these documents are donated to the National Archives, where they will provide definitive proof that the Hatherwick fortune was built on systematic fraud and cultural destruction. The resulting legal proceedings will drag on for decades, bankrupting the trust in legal fees whilst Nicora grows up in foster care, because neither of his parents will be available to raise him." Aroha looked at her son, who was watching the conversation with the sort of intense focus that his autism gave him in high-stress situations. Despite his fear and discomfort, he seemed to understand that something monumentally important was happening, something that would determine not just his immediate fate, but the entire trajectory of his future life. "The papers," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly do they prove?" Scarlett's smile was sharp and predatory, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "They prove that my great-grandfather systematically deceived Maori landowners about the legal implications of the documents they were signing. They prove that he used shell companies and false identities to circumvent government regulations designed to protect indigenous land rights. They prove that several of the transactions involved outright forgery of signatures and fabrication of consent documents." She paused, allowing the full weight of these revelations to sink in before delivering the final blow. "Most importantly, they prove that the 1923 purchase of the sacred burial grounds at Rangiriri was accomplished by threatening the Idwi leaders with military action if they refused to sell. 3,000 acres of land considered tapu by the local people, sold for £30 and a case of whiskey because the alternative was armed conflict with government forces." The horror of what Scarlett was describing made Aroha feel physically sick, but it also made her understand why Tom had been willing to sacrifice everything to make amends for his family's crimes. The Hatherwick fortune wasn't just built on sharp business practices or cultural insensitivity. It was built on systematic fraud and cultural terrorism that had destroyed entire communities and violated sacred places that could never be restored. But as she looked at Nicora, chained and frightened in this toxic industrial wasteland, she realized that the choice before her wasn't really about historical justice or financial restitution. It was about whether she was willing to become complicit in her family's crimes in order to save her son's life. Without hesitation, Aroha reached for the envelope and tore it open, revealing pages of yellowed documents covered with signatures, official seals, and handwritten notes that told the story of systematic exploitation and deception. The papers felt fragile in her hands, like they might crumble to dust if handled roughly, but their historical significance was undeniable. She looked at Scarlett, then at Nicora, then at the chemical drums that would provide more than enough heat to reduce these documents to ash and memory. "If I burn these papers," she said, "Nicora goes free right now. No conditions, no delays, no further negotiations." "The moment the last page turns to ash," Scarlett confirmed, "the boy is released and you both walk out of here to start your new lives with the financial security that $5 million provides." Aroha struck the match with steady hands, watching as the flame caught the corner of the first document. A deed of sale that transferred 3,000 acres of sacred land for less money than most people spent on groceries. As the fire spread across the pages, consuming names and signatures and official seals that could never be replaced, she whispered a silent apology to all the people whose suffering had been documented in these papers, all the voices that would now be silenced forever. But before the flames could consume everything, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air like a sword. Police vehicles were surrounding the facility, their flashing lights visible through the broken windows as emergency response teams prepared to breach the building. Scarlett's composure cracked for the first time since Aroha had arrived. This wasn't part of the arrangement, she snarled, pulling out her phone with movements that spoke of barely controlled panic. Who did you contact? Who else knows about this location? But Aroha was already moving, using the distraction to grab Nikora and begin working on the locks that held his chains in place. Nobody, she called back over her shoulder as the sound of tactical teams approaching grew louder. But my husband is smarter than you gave him credit for, and he has friends you didn't know about. The last thing Aroha saw before the tactical team stormed the processing floor was Tom himself, somehow free from police custody, leading a mixed group of officers and Maori community leaders through the facility's main entrance. His presence meant that whatever legal trap Scarlett had set for him had been neutralized, and whatever evidence had been gathered from his public confession had been used not to destroy him, but to build a case against the real criminals who had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. As Nikora's chains finally came free and mother and son were reunited in an embrace that felt like salvation itself, Aroha realized that the ashes of the burned documents might have silenced some voices from the past, but they had also cleared the way for truth-telling that would echo into the future, and perhaps finally, allow her family to heal from wounds that had been generations in the making. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the rolling hills of the Waikato in shades of gold and green that seemed to promise hope for futures that had once appeared impossible. The Hamilton District Court had handed down its judgment in what legal commentators were calling the most significant case of historical justice and corporate fraud in New Zealand's modern history, and the reverberations were still being felt throughout the country's agricultural and legal communities. Tom stood in the doorway of what had once been the main milking shed of Hatherwick Pastoral Holdings, but which now bore a hand-carved sign in both English and Te Reo Maori: Kokiri Center for Neurodivergent Children, Warhawora Monga Tamariki Motuhake. The building had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to his great-grandfather, a place of healing rather than exploitation, of community service rather than private profit. The court's ruling had been unprecedented in its scope and severity. Scarlett Hatherwick had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud, whilst the systematic investigation of the family's business practices had revealed a century-long pattern of tax evasion, environmental violations, and deliberate circumvention of indigenous rights legislation. The Hatherwick Pastoral Holdings Trust had been dissolved entirely, its assets distributed between the government, various IWE trusts, and a new foundation dedicated to supporting families dealing with developmental disabilities. But perhaps most significantly for Tom's personal circumstances, the court had accepted his plea agreement that allowed him to serve his sentence through 5 years of supervised community service, managing the transformation of his family's former agricultural empire into a network of social services that would benefit the very communities his ancestors had exploited. The electronic monitoring bracelet around his ankle was a constant reminder of his legal obligations, but it was also a symbol of accountability that he wore with something approaching pride. Aroha walked through the former dairy facility, carrying a folder of administrative documents that would have once detailed milk production quotas and profit margins, but which now contained therapy schedules and educational assessments for the 67 children who received services at the center. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that the buildings which had once processed the liquid wealth of stolen land now echoed with the laughter and conversation of young people learning to navigate a world that was finally beginning to understand and accommodate their unique needs. The transformation hadn't been easy, either logistically or emotionally. There had been months of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and community resistance from some quarters who couldn't accept that the Hatherwick family was genuinely committed to making amends for historical wrongs. But gradually, as the center began operating and its benefits became apparent, even the most skeptical observers had been forced to acknowledge that something unprecedented was happening here. Nikora's own journey had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. The trauma of his kidnapping had initially made his autism symptoms more severe, but the combination of specialized therapy and the security that came from finally understanding his true heritage had gradually helped him develop coping strategies that his previous life had never offered. He spent his afternoons in a sensory integration room that had been custom designed by occupational therapists who understood that some minds needed different kinds of spaces to feel safe and functional. Today, as Aroha watched through the large windows that had replaced the old loading bay doors, Nikora was working in the therapeutic garden, that now occupied the space where milking equipment had once stood. His movements were still careful and deliberate, still marked by the precise patterns that helped him manage sensory input, but there was a contentment in his face that hadn't been there before. The truth about his family was finally revealed. Ko takutaonga nui kokoi, Tom said softly as he joined Aroha at the window, using the T-Rio phrase that had become something of a family motto since their world had been rebuilt from the ashes of deception. You are my greatest treasure. The words carried weight that went far beyond romantic sentiment. In the months since Scarlett's arrest and the dissolution of the trust, Tom had discovered that losing his inherited wealth had been the greatest liberation of his life. The constant pressure to maintain a facade, to protect family secrets, to justify his existence through the perpetuation of historical injustices, all of it had vanished the moment the court had stripped away the financial empire that had defined his identity since birth. Aroha smiled, though her expression still carried traces of the wariness that had developed during their ordeal. Trust, once shattered, required time and consistency to rebuild, and she was still learning to reconcile the man she had fallen in love with at the farmer's market with the heir to a criminal enterprise who had hidden his true identity for months. But watching him work with the children at the center, seeing his genuine commitment to making amends for his family's crimes, had gradually convinced her that the kindness she had first witnessed wasn't an act, but the truest expression of who he really was. The Henderson boy made eye contact for the first time yesterday, she said, referring to a 7-year-old whose autism had previously made social interaction nearly impossible. His mother cried when the therapist told her, real tears of joy. Not the kind of crying we've all been doing too much of lately. Tom nodded, understanding the significance of such small victories in the context of their work. Every child who learned to communicate more effectively, every family that found support they hadn't known was available, every moment of progress represented not just individual healing, but a kind of cosmic rebalancing that helped offset the harm his family had caused over 4 generations. The center operated on a funding model that was as innovative as it was sustainable. Each liter of milk produced by the dairy cooperative that now operated on the former Hatherwick lands generated revenue that was split between the farming families who did the actual work and the social services that supported families like Nikora's. It was a system that acknowledged both the legitimate needs of agricultural workers and the historical debt owed to communities that had been systematically excluded from the benefits of their own land's productivity. Through the late afternoon, as the autumn light began to fade over the Waikato River, Tom and Aroha walked together through grounds that told the story of their family's transformation. Where industrial milking sheds had once stood, there were now classrooms equipped with sensory-friendly lighting and acoustics. Where cattle yards had confined livestock for maximum efficiency, there were now therapeutic gardens where children could experience the calming effects of nature at their own pace and comfort level. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of change was the memorial that had been erected where the old farmhouse had once stood. The stone monument, carved by local Maori artisans using traditional techniques, listed the names of all the iwi whose lands had been taken by the Hatherwick family, along with the specific territories that were being returned to community control. It was a permanent acknowledgement of historical wrongs that could never be fully repaired, but which could at least be honestly confronted and partially addressed. As they reached the memorial, Aroha pulled a small object from her pocket, the Punamu pendant that Nikora had carried since childhood, cracked during his escape from the abandoned dairy plant, but still beautiful in its imperfection. The greenstone caught the last rays of sunlight, its surface reflecting the complex patterns that told stories of pressure and time, of breaking and healing, of beauty that emerged from forces that could have destroyed but instead created something stronger. Coro Williams wants to perform a blessing ceremony next month, Tom said, referring to the elderly Kamatua who had witnessed his confession at the marae. He says the land needs to be formally welcomed back to its proper relationship with the people, and the children who receive services here need to understand that they're part of something larger than their individual challenges. Aroha nodded, holding the cracked punamu up to the light so that it created patterns of green and gold on the memorial stone. And after that, what happens when your sentence is complete and you're free to leave if you want to? It was a question they had both been avoiding, though it hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Tom's legal obligations would end in 4.5 years, and theoretically he would then be free to rebuild his life in whatever way he chose. He could leave New Zealand entirely, start over somewhere that didn't know the Hatherwick name, pursue the kind of quiet anonymity that his notoriety had made impossible here. But as he looked at Nikora, now 9 years old and running toward them across the therapeutic garden with the slightly uncoordinated gait that would always mark him as different, but no longer made him seem vulnerable, Tom realized that the question answered itself. "This is home," he said simply, "not because of the land or the buildings or even the family history, but because this is where we learned to tell the truth about who we really are. This is where we discovered that some kinds of wealth can't be inherited or stolen or lost in legal proceedings." As if summoned by their conversation, Nikora reached them carrying a handful of flowers he had picked from the memorial garden. Native plants that had been chosen specifically because they had grown on this land before European settlement. Species that had survived despite decades of agricultural modification and were now being carefully restored to their original habitats. "For Mum," he said, offering the flowers to Aroha with the sort of formal politeness that characterized his social interactions, but which now carried genuine warmth rather than anxious compliance. The therapist said that giving presents helps people understand how much you care about them. As Aroha accepted the flowers and embraced her son, Tom felt something settle in his chest that he had never experienced during all his years as heir to a fortune built on exploitation and deception. It was the feeling of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, surrounded by people whose love wasn't conditional on his wealth or status, or ability to maintain facades that had never reflected his true nature. The sun set over the Waikato with the kind of spectacular display that reminded everyone why this corner of New Zealand was considered one of the most beautiful places on Earth. As the three of them walked back toward the center, where other families were arriving for the evening support group that had become an integral part of the community's weekly rhythm, Tom realized that his great-grandfather's legacy of exploitation and cultural destruction had finally been transformed into something that honored the land and the people rather than simply extracting profit from their subjugation. Behind them, the memorial stone reflected the last light of day, its carved names and returned territories serving as permanent proof that some kinds of justice, while slow in coming, could eventually arrive with the force of historical inevitability. And in the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed across fields that had been returned to their proper purpose, not as engines of private wealth, but as foundations for community healing that would continue long after everyone involved in this particular story had become ancestors themselves. The cracked punamu in Aroha's pocket caught the last rays of sunlight, its imperfect surface reflecting the truth that some of the most beautiful things in life emerge not from perfection, but from the courage to acknowledge brokenness and transform it into something stronger, more honest, and infinitely more valuable than anything that could be bought with inherited gold. When the echo of the haka fades and the Waikato wind carries the golden dust from the silos, there remains the invisible mark of Aroha, Tom, and Nikora's choices, a scar that crosses generations, and now pulses like a bridge between past and future. The once-stained lands now shelter children's laughter, and each liter of milk sold reminds us that wealth only finds meaning when it returns to the world the life it once took. It required a mother to burn her own legacy to save a son. It required a man to trade freedom for reparation. It required a community to transform pain into care. Perhaps this is how the purest love reveals itself, cracked, imperfect, but capable of flourishing in the cracks. And you? Would you have the courage to set fire to the last piece of your inheritance to protect those you love? Would you accept money marked by injustice if it were the only key to open a door of hope? Or like Tom, would you dedicate your days to serving those you once hurt? Reflect on how many times we choose silent comfort over noisy truth, and how many opportunities for redemption still pass before our eyes, waiting for us to let pride die so that something greater can be born. If this journey touched your heart, follow the channel, like and share with those who need reminding that every wound can become a source of healing. And tell me, which city are you watching from?